She was never asked to return, not for a memorial or cameo, and not even after the ovation faded and the ratings dropped. She went from being Carson's golden girl to becoming invisible in an instant. No justification, only a cruel, quiet exile. Not only that, but she was never permitted to return to the Johnny Carson program following this. Johnny Carson couldn't help but smile at a few celebrities as well. And Hollywood pulled away when Johnny became aloof. How can a late-night ruler use charm and terror to build an empire? We're going to learn soon. Once upon a time, one show in Hollywood had all the answers. This was the spot if you wanted attention. You desired to be regarded with respect. All you needed to do was get that 5-minute period. And life changed all of a sudden if you smashed it. However, a catch existed. No one dared to publicly disclose the restrictions that came with that spotlight, but everyone knew what they were. The worst thing is that you were never in trouble with the powerful people in Hollywood because you were cut off as soon as you did. Several of the most well-known figures in the field were abruptly shut out. Their decision to no longer belong was made by Johnny Carson, not because they lacked talent or because the audience didn't like them. And after Johnny abandoned you, the industry as a whole followed suit. However, the majority of viewers at home never seen any of this. They merely tuned in to laugh. There was a subdued anxiety, though, beneath the laughter and cheers. It ended with a single misstep and a single misinterpretation. Occasionally, it was something easy. It had been problematic when a visitor made jokes that were too offensive or when they didn't give Johnny the final say. In other instances, it was more profound and resulted from problems with loyalty and business choices that seemed betraying. Personal feuds that began off-camera and concluded in complete silence were another. It was all subtle, which added to the intensity. Publicly, no one was called out. Messy headlines and large, dramatic clashes were absent. They simply stopped coming. Additionally, if you asked around, you would likely receive a muted response or a shrug. However, the silence was terrible to those on the other side. One invitation lost could mean years of effort. Carson's ban wasn't just a blow to your pride. Your career can suffer as a result. The majority of people never hear that part of the tale. Behind the scenes was where the actual story was told. In the names that were never spoken again and the vacant guest seats. So why was The Tonight Show so influential? What allowed it such authority over people's lives, reputations, and futures? In order to respond to it, we must examine the show more closely. The Tonight Show era without first-hand experience, it's difficult to convey the magnitude of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson's impact. It was more than a late-night conversation program. If you were a Hollywood heavyweight with a new movie to promote, a budding star, or a frightened stand-up comedian, here was the place to be. The basic fact was that if you got a place on The Tonight Show, you were made. There was something about Johnny that made everything seem so easy. He smiled mischievously and allowed a punchline to linger for a fraction of a second longer than you anticipated. There was no teaching his timing. And let's not even talk about Karnak the Magnificent, who played the role of a fortune teller at a dollar store, held sealed envelopes to his head, and told jokes that somehow became funnier because they were so absurd. It was iconic despite being silly and strange. The actual power, however, was in his ability to start a career with only a nod, a laugh, and a simple wave to welcome a guest to the interview chair following their performance. The Holy Grail was that wave from Carson. The significance of the moment might be attested to by figures like Jerry Seinfeld and David Letterman. They would also tell you that it changed everything if you questioned them. And every single night, millions of people tuned in. Before streaming, you could watch videos on your phone while listening to podcasts in the background. Either you missed it or you watched Johnny while he was on. And nobody, believe me, desired to miss it. His sketches, guests, musical performance, and speech were what made it memorable for everyone and have since been imitated. Talk show hosts Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon both used it. Additionally, Stephen Colbert, presenter of The Late Night Show with Stephen Colbert, is currently using it as well. Carson was not merely a show host. The blueprint for modern late-night television was created by him. He was untouchable for the majority of the 3 decades he managed his empire with ease. However, a different Johnny emerged when the cameras stopped recording and the cheers subsided. It wasn't quite that easy behind the humor and charm. At times, they even became blatantly ugly. There were drawbacks to Carson's influence, you see. There would be consequences if you were to offend him. You wouldn't simply lose your spot on the show. The whole conversation was interrupted for you. You could become famous if Johnny approves of you, but you could be completely destroyed if you don't get his approval. This was much more than just sour feelings or losing out on a TV spot. For the industry at the time, being banned from The Tonight Show was akin to being forgotten. Other shows would distance themselves, studio officials would become hesitant, and bookers would cease phoning. Hesitant to tread on Johnny's toes. There was nothing he had to say in public. He was silent enough. It was obvious to everyone that you were done if Carson was done with you. He didn't have to make the public announcement, which made it much more vicious. To stop the person on the other end of his microphone from becoming booked, he only needed to share his day. And everyone in the industry never fails to notice it. Some comedians made an effort to ignore it. Rich Little and others had to learn their lessons the hard way. Although the official explanation was that his stuff had simply become stale, renowned impressionist Rich Little was fired for ridiculing Johnny too frequently. While promoting Wayne's World, Dana Carvey, another comic, gave a perfect impression of Carson. Carvey was banned by Carson, who didn't say anything about it and didn't think it was humorous. Simply like that. The frightening thing was that there was never a rulebook or obvious line to identify the edge until you tumbled off it. Who then had the audacity to confront Johnny, and who was the victim? The consequences from Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers was the one person Johnny Carson mentored more than anyone. Johnny was drawn to her because she was a new, straightforward comedian in the 1960s with a sharp sense of humor and a fiery personality. In an era when female comedians were not very common, Johnny introduced her to The Tonight Show and established her as a regular. Furthermore, he offered her a chance to become a national celebrity, particularly after she was drastically rejected for being washed up at the age of 31. When Carson welcomed Joan onto The Tonight Show, she was barely making ends meet while working hard in the clubs and hustling for sets. He smiled at the camera after she killed the first set and said, "America, you're going to hear a lot about this girl." Everything was altered by that single line. Carson helped Rivers go from nothing to being hired as a writer for Tonight's Show in the blink of an eye. In addition to allowing her to flourish, he fostered her, supported her, and even invited her to stay with him on his nights off. To the outside world, the king of late nights and his dependable queen-in-waiting appeared to be a dream team. But there was a storm building behind all the laughter and cheering. Joan received an opportunity from Fox to start her own late-night program in 1986. She had the opportunity to anchor a big late-night talk show for the first time as a woman, which was momentous news because Fox was a new network. The choice wasn't made lightly by her. Joan was afraid, according to interviews. Although she didn't want to, she also realized that when Carson finally resigned, NBC had no intention of giving her The Tonight Show. She accepted the Fox deal after learning from NBC execs that she wasn't even being considered, which was the hardest part. She didn't tell Johnny first, though, and it was the thing that made all the difference. Rather than from Joan, Carson learned about it from rumors. He was mad. It wasn't the sort of anger you shout about and then move on from either. Carson's anger was chilly, quiet, and well thought out. He refused to talk to her again after hanging up on her when she called. For years, he failed to notice her attempts to contact him and did not return her letters. From then on, she was gone. She was banned and blacklisted in addition to being kicked off The Tonight Show. Even worse, nobody was allowed on Johnny's couch if they dared to appear on her Fox show. According to show insiders, Carson felt caught off guard. It wasn't only a new program that she left for, in his opinion. He was more about loyalty. She had, he believed, gone behind his back. In Carson's perspective, such betrayal was not acceptable. He thought of her as a daughter. But once you betrayed that trust with Johnny, you were done, one former employee recalled. Joan herself was devastated. Even years later, when she spoke about Johnny in interviews, her voice still cracked. She referred to him as the most significant person in her career. Every year, she wrote him a letter, praying and hoping for a response, but she never heard back. No words at all. Silence didn't end it either. Carson ensured that her name would never again appear on The Tonight Show. Video footage of her appearances was suppressed for decades. She became the invisible woman on the show since her name was not stated. In a subsequent post, she explained why she believed Carson was upset at her departure, writing, "I believe he truly felt that I was a woman that just was his, that I wouldn't leave him. This may sound incredibly twisted, but I can't figure out what else was going on." Joan confessed to crying when Carson died in 2005. Not because the world had lost a significant person, but rather because she had lost her mentor and the first man who ever had faith in her. She was even more devastated that he died before they could work out their disagreements. "I would have done anything to make it right," she previously stated in an interview. Joan wasn't alone. He refused to even look at me when I tried to communicate. Some were subjected to Carson's fury in real time. Not everyone who was impolite or disrespectful was banned from The Tonight Show. Others simply were unsure of when to stop. Some believed they could prod the bear and then go. Even if you didn't mean to, you were done with Johnny Carson once you crossed a certain line. Bobcat Goldthwait, for instance. He was crazy and had an erratic, boisterous energy that might make you laugh or uneasy. One evening, he went too far. On live television, Bobcat purposefully set the chair on fire during a guest appearance. He considered that a stunt. Everyone didn't like that, though, because it was a horrible joke. Despite the fact that Jay Leno was hosting at the time, several people believed Carson would not have been impressed. Bobcat was banned from the show after the network became incensed. In addition, he was charged with arson, found guilty, and fined $2,700 in addition to the chair's approximate $700 purchase price. He also received a sentence that required him to make fire safety PSAs. He was never seen on that stage again. He never had another chance at late night after that one moment. Next up is Kathy Griffin. Kathy's brand is all about being outspoken, brazen, and unrepentant. She doesn't really care who is offended, and she discusses topics that most people ignore. Many late-night hosts were not pleased with that approach, particularly Jay Leno, who followed Carson. Kathy's edgy humor was viewed as excessive more than once. She eventually found herself barred from a number of programs, including The Tonight Show. Even though Carson didn't directly ban her, she certainly matched his criteria for someone who wouldn't have passed muster. After a few inappropriate jokes, the doors silently shut. On the other hand, Melanie Chartoff didn't cause any trouble. She didn't make fun of anyone in front of the camera or curse on air. She merely cracked jokes that weren't particularly serious. Typically, her remarks caused other crew members to chuckle. And Johnny himself found the jokes funny. Being one of the few individuals who had a good relationship with Carson, she had no problems with him. She even had an amazing appearance with George Burns and Richard Dawson in 1982 as a guest on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. The problem with Carson is that he has the power to create or ruin a career, but he may also kill it if you're not careful. You are out if he took it the wrong way, even if you didn't mean to step on his toes and it was only a private joke. But not every Tonight Show disqualification resulted from a disobedient or rebellious act. Some of them were simply miscommunications, sincere errors, misinterpreted jokes, or moves that weren't cleared. And all of a sudden, one action could make you unpopular with Johnny. Howie Mandel had to learn that lesson the hard way. Johnny Carson was still in his infancy, learning the ropes and attempting to make an impression. He brought a huge stuffed tiger on stage one evening. Not part of the plan, not approved by the makers, and a prop. It was meant to make people laugh, be humorous, and be stupid. Surprises, particularly ones that disrupted the show's pace, were something Johnny detested. Howie was therefore never welcomed back after that evening. Just silence, no official prohibition, no irate letter. Brutally cold quiet. And then there was the gifted and charismatic Lola Falana. Every time she entered a room, the stage was illuminated by her. However, she was candid about racism in the industry during one appearance. She discussed the experiences of black women in entertainment. At a time when most people were too afraid to even mention such things, she was forthright and honest. However, that type of late-night TV conversation was not something Johnny was prepared for. Then, suddenly, Lola was gone. No additional invitation was sent to her. The truth was still not ready to be heard in that environment in America. Despite his immense influence, Carson was unwilling to upset the status quo. Not excluded was Artie Lang. His tale takes a different direction. Carson opted not to prohibit him. Conan O'Brien blacklisted him years later. Artie has been struggling with addiction. He was challenging to control and erratic. So Conan's group severed relations. It seemed like a stomach punch at the time. In retrospect, however, Artie claims it saved his life. To get assistance, he had to push pause. And he truly thanked Conan after he was sober. "My comeback began when I was banned," he remarked. A ban could sometimes be the end of your career. At times, it was simply the harshest wake-up call the world had ever seen. There was one occasion when Johnny Carson did speak, and this time they were loud, but otherwise he did his job in silence. A quarrel in Hollywood. For a period, Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson had an old-fashioned show business friendship. Both of them were independent stars. While Carson dominated Burbank's late-night scene from behind his desk, Newton wowed Vegas audiences with his smooth charm and voice. Everyone was grinning, laughing, and shaking hands when Wayne appeared on The Tonight Show. However, egos don't always mesh well in the same space, and friendships in Hollywood include fine print. The course of events changed in the early 1980s when Newton boldly outbid Carson for a share of the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. From Newton's perspective, it was merely business, thus it wasn't personal. However, it seemed like a challenge to Carson, as if a friend were venturing into hostile terrain. He was not confronted backstage by Johnny. Like he always did, he made it into substance. Carson began inserting jokes into his monologues night after night, but they weren't really funny. He made fun of Newton's appearance and questioned whether he was a man, referred to him as a cruel person, and made jokes about his way of life. These jokes came over as disguised attacks rather than late-night humor. Newton didn't listen to the audience's laughter. Wayne finally lost it, and one day he barged into NBC studios without any cameras or a bodyguard. Backstage, he personally located Carson and urged him to stop it right away. Depending on who was narrating, that confrontation had different details. However, one thing remained the same. When Carson ceased making jokes about Newton, the mocking immediately stopped. Likewise, their friendship did. The Tonight Show never asked Wayne Newton to return. Not for a casual appearance, not even as a guest. Carson had gotten the message. However, just like everything else in his life, the link also ended as the curtain came down. The fissures in Carson's personal life also developed as his influence did. To comprehend the man behind the curtain, let's take a step back before we get into that. The ascent of Johnny Carson to fame. Before he became the king of late night, Johnny Carson was simply a scrawny Nebraska kid with a dream and a deck of cards. Calling himself the Great Carsoni, he began doing magic acts for his family when he was just 12 years old. Without speaking too much, he could effortlessly hold anyone's attention thanks to his stage presence. However, magic was more than just a pastime for Johnny. He needed to be his best self. He later earned a degree in speech and radio from the University of Nebraska after serving in the Navy during World War II. He then made his living through odd jobs in TV and radio, moving up the ranks one at a time. His big break came when he was asked to cover for Jack Benny, and all of a sudden, people took notice. Carson was effortless, not simply good. It wasn't until he took over The Tonight Show in 1962 that things truly took off. In addition to enjoying a good laugh, millions of people tuned in every night to feel as though they were spending time with a familiar person who had excellent timing and razor-sharp wit. You wouldn't have to do much to have Johnny chuckle. He had the unique ability to make it seem as though he wasn't making an effort. That's what gave it its magical quality. A new type of performance, however, took place off stage. It wasn't just about the Johnny that everyone saw at 11:30 p.m. Carson was extremely private behind the scenes, often in a cruel way. Many times, his acquaintances, colleagues, and even visitors who believed they would get along with him had to learn the hard way. That Johnny avoided direct contact with others. He adored the camera, and he had a great personality. He did, however, control and protect what people saw. Everyone and everything had a place. And a handshake and a joke weren't enough to get into his personal life. Losing control was something he detested. His ability to control his stage was reflected in his interpersonal interactions, particularly with visitors. There was a noticeable change if someone spoke over him, outshone him, or took too long to reach the punchline. Even as the temperature dropped, the smile would remain. Despite having America's most watched late-night show, Johnny occasionally came across as the most lonely person in the room. Off the stage, the tension persisted into his marriages, his family, and his later years. Even though Johnny Carson was a genius on the soundstage, his private life was anything but a slick performance. He was happiest at home, if the late-night desk was his throne. His 4 previous marriages each had their own tale of longing, misunderstandings, and silent breakdown. He married Jody Walcott for the first time before he became famous. But their isolation from one another grew as Carson's star climbed. He later acknowledged that he wasn't particularly good at staying faithful, which led to rumors of infidelity. Anything stable was eroded by the attention, the ego, and the late hours. On the surface, Joanne Copeland and his second marriage appeared to be spectacular. She was intelligent, attractive, and there for him through some of his most trying times. In private, however, that marriage was a battleground. Infidelity was reciprocal. And the strain finally caused them to split up. One of Carson's most well-known on-air jokes about his divorces was that his ex-wives took everything but his cufflinks with them. The jokes were merely armor, though, and beyond the snark lurked sadness. Highs, lows, and a highly public breakdown were all part of his third marriage to model Joanna Holland. But by 1987, when he wed Alexis Moss, things had changed. Perhaps he was finally sick of the spotlight constantly shining into his living room, or perhaps he simply thought that it was time. His last marriage was more secret and modest. He appeared to have at last achieved some serenity, at least from the outside. However, not all of it could be fixed. One of Carson's most well-known and tense relationships was with Rick, one of his 3 sons from his first marriage. As the son of America's most popular TV personality, Rick battled substance misuse, legal issues, and the pressures of his position. Carson was saddened in 1991 when Rick lost his life in a horrific vehicle accident. That was evident in his eyes the following time he was on TV. The man who had made the country laugh now appeared frail. Unlike other celebrities, Carson didn't stay to celebrate his retirement in 1992. He didn't rush into another endeavor or try to get attention. He simply relocated to Malibu and vanished. In addition to declining nearly every interview, he spent more time on his yacht. Although he became a loner, he wasn't resentful or anything. All he wanted was an end to television and everything that accompanied it. The mythology of Carson endured despite the world being kept out. Johnny's legacy. One look from Johnny Carson was enough to make anyone in the room chuckle. You may be around him for years and never truly get to know him, though. There were many paradoxes in his life. He was witty, charismatic, and the epitome of cool on stage. Outside of the theater, he was quiet, reticent, and nearly inaccessible. And that contradiction accompanied him all the way to the end. It was too late by the time the world found out that Carson was gravely sick. Once the center of attention, the man softly faded into the background. It was the culmination of a lifetime of smoking that ultimately caught up with him. Without much ceremony or a lengthy farewell, he died in 2005, and the curtain fell for good. But Johnny was never one for long goodbyes. But Carson had already made his mark on television history long before his health began to deteriorate. He was honored with a Peabody Award in 1987 for 25 years of hosting The Tonight Show, which marks 25 years of cultural commentary, late-night charm, and unadulterated television brilliance. In addition to being a well-liked TV host, he earned tens of millions of dollars annually, making him the highest-paid figure on television by the middle of the 1970s. At that level, it's obvious that he was a big star in the entertainment business. Carson, however, began to back off. It may have been foresight or burnout. He started reducing his appearances and making room for guest hosts. The guest host Joan Rivers was one of them. The conclusion of that story was ironic, but Carson's performance was the highlight. Even when he wasn't there, his presence was always felt. His impact did not fade away with him. Today's late-night television still has his fingerprints. Jimmy Kimmel's shrewd edge and Jimmy Fallon's youthful charm are both influenced by Carson's DNA. The desk bits, the friendly banter with guests, and the monologues. The original recipe was created by Carson. Just a little seasoning has been added by everyone since. Johnny wasn't flawless, of course. He was an expert in his field, but he could also be aloof, domineering, and even harsh at times. An influence from culture. A man with a knack for room ownership. Even if that room represented the entire nation. With a little humor, a little gossip, and a lot of elegance, he helped to create how America closes its day. That is the peculiar enchantment of Johnny Carson. It wasn't necessary to know the man to feel that way. He left no autobiography or candid interviews behind. He used to control the night, but now we can still hear the echo of his laughter when we watch late-night repeats. Did you ever attend any of Johnny Carson's performances? What are your thoughts on the ways in which his influence affected people's lives? Please share in the comments. Please make sure to hit the notification bell, like, and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any of our uploads. To view more videos similar to this one, click on the next one while it's playing.